In this lecture, we'll discuss about the administration and form of government during ancient Iron Age Indian civilization, in particularly the Vedic period and during the empires from Mauryan period to Gupta period. So, as in the Vedic period, kingship was the most common form of government. The king was not an absolute ruler, as the states were still tribal in character. So he did not enjoy many privileges. When the states became bigger, the powers of the king also increased, but did not become absolute. The king was always regarded as the servant of the Dharma, which was a body of laws based on custom as well as tradition, supposedly of divine origin. Another factor that prevented kings from assuming absolute power was the caste system or the Varna system. The king was a Kshatriya and was responsible for such non-religious functions of the state as welfare and administration, and in particularly spiritual authority was the concern of the Brahmins who performed the sacrifices and other sacred rites. The political practices in India underwent many changes when the empires were formed. Most of the republics which were ruled by aristocracies were destroyed. The powers and privileges of the kings increased, and he was now the head of government and directed the entire administrative machine. He himself appointed the highest officials. No checks were recognized to the king's authority. Meanwhile, the ideal of the Chakravartin or universal emperor had also developed. It was not merely an ideal of conquest, but also rule according to Dharma. So under the Mauryas, almost all of India was directly ruled by one king. The provinces had governors who were usually princes of the royal family. A hierarchy of officials assisted the governor. The aim of administration was not merely efficient rule to maintain the empire, but also social welfare. The ideal of kingship, as laid down in the Arthashastra of Kautilya, is that in the happiness of his subjects lies the happiness of the king, and in their welfare is welfare. The state devoted to a good deal of care to such public works as the water systems and gardens prevailing during that period. After the Mauryas, their successors in Magadha continued the form of administration they had inherited. The centralized administration of the Mauryas soon became weak, however, as a result of the division of the country into small political units. The Kushanas, whose kingdom was fairly extensive, developed a system under which there were more or less independent divisions, making the kingdom a loose federation. The Kushana king bore the title Great King of Kings. And during the Satavahana kingdom, centralizing elements of Mauryan administration were continued as these territories had been parts of the Mauryan Empire. The Gupta administration was well organized through the provinces. Though frequent changes in dynasties affected the administrative system, at the top, the administration of the village remained more or less the same. The villages grew into autonomous units with a headman and elders who had authority over law and other public works, local disputes, and the collection of revenue for the state. And now we'll discuss about the very socio-economic conditions during the Vedic and the 6th century BC, where up to the Mauryans and the Gupta's period. So, mainly it was relating to cattle raising agriculture. They were metal workers, potters, weavers, carpenters, also textile industries, ivory and iron work and other arts and craftsmen were found during these periods, and also the guild system which was known as Shrenis and the very Varna system, the ashramas and the family system. As the Aryans were a cattle raising people when they came to India, cattle was the primary form of wealth, and even the value of a human being was measured in terms of it. Gradually, however, agriculture became an important occupation. In fact, the Aryans' arrival in the Gangetic Valley was accompanied by the extension of agriculture in this area. Vast jungles were cleared and burned. The use of iron made the land fit for cultivation. The Aryans developed other occupations along with agriculture. The carpenter had an esteemed place in the village life and economy. Metal workers also became important. There were also potters, tanners, weavers, and many other craftsmen. The growth of these occupations introduced a certain degree of specialization and led to the beginning of trade. Around 600 BC, many new towns developed around the centers of trade and industry. Some of these were Rajagriha, Champa, Kashi, Kaushambi, Takshashila, and Vaishali. Trade grew with the West and with Central Asia as a result of the Iranian, Greek and other invasions. India's trade and cultural contacts with Southeast Asia also increased. Many industries such as textile, ivory, iron work developed. Iron was not used in India until after the coming of the Aryans. Artisans producing specialized goods were organized into guilds called Shrenis. These guilds in course of time became subcastes. Later trade relations between the Romans and the southern kingdoms grew. After the decline of the Guptas and the disintegration of the Western Roman Empire, trade with Rome declined but increased with Southeast Asian countries and with the east coast of Africa. In this period, however, there also grew the idea that travel to overseas lands led to pollution and should not be undertaken by those wishing to retain their caste purity. The most important features of the Indian society since ancient time has been the Varna system. So, a Varna was much more than a class or caste. Caste determined one's entire life and that of one's children and their children and so on in ancient times. Caste determined the position of an individual in the eyes of law. Even in religious matters, different castes enjoyed a higher or a lower status. Thus, the caste system meant a division of society into superior men and inferior men. It has resulted in the division of society into closed groups with minimum mutual contact and weakening of societies. The caste system can be traced back to early Vedic times, but at that time it was known as the Varna system. So when the Aryans came to India, they were divided into three main groups. These were the warriors, priests and all of the rest of the people. But these groups were not as yet caste. It was possible then for members of the same family to follow different occupations. However, when the conquest of the indigenous inhabitants began, rigid social divisions were brought in. The Aryans divided themselves into the Kshatriyas, the warriors class, the Brahmanas, the priests class, and the Vaishyas, the cultivators class. The non-Aryan inhabitants of India, whom the Aryans called Dasas, became the Sudras. The Sudras also included the offspring of the Aryan Dasa mixed marriages. Of these castes, the Kshatriyas and the Brahmans enjoyed more or less the same status. Though the position of the Brahmanas rose as the importance of ritual performed by them grew, many Vaishyas became landowners and traders instead of cultivators. The group that later consisted of Sudras. This division of society into caste was sanctified by the Vedic literature, according to which the Brahmanas were born from the head of the Creator, the Kshatriyas from his arms, the Vaishyas from his thighs, and the Shudras from his feet. A later body of literature called the Grihasastras or Grihasutras made the system even more rigid. The body of literature known as Dharmasastras furthered the process of rigidity and inequality. Different laws were prescribed for different castes. Punishment for the same crime varied according to the caste of the criminal. The Dharmasastras gave full spiritual sanctity to the caste system and provided very harsh treatment for the Shudras. However, in a few respects, the system was still flexible. Marriage between the male of a higher caste and the female of a lower caste was permissible. After some time, even this flexibility disappeared. There was also another group of people who were outcasts. Payan, the Chinese traveller who came to India during the rule of the Guptas, mentions them. They lived in separate parts of villages, and even their appearance in the presence of others was regarded a cause of pollution. Their condition was much worse than that of the Shudras. Within the framework of the four castes or varnas, there were subcastes within each caste. The subcastes were also hereditary and were based on occupation. The subcaste became very important in Hindu society as they determined occupation and marriage rules. As a result of the rise of Jainism and Buddhism and the settlement of foreigners, India, following invasion, the rigidity of the caste system became somewhat less severe. However, when the Turkish invasions began in 10th century, a rigid caste system was prevailing in India. The caste system, however, provided stability to ancient Indian society. Ancient Indian society was patriarchal, the eldest male being the head of the family. A son lived with his parents, wife and children. Monogamy was the general norm, though polygamy was permitted, and kings and rich people had many wives. We also find reference to existence of polyandry, or women with many husbands. In the south of India, there were some matriarchal societies. And as regarding a man's life was governed by ashramas system, and it was divided into 4 ashramas, such as Brahmacharya, the period of study of the sacred text under a teacher, and the second one is Grahastha, the period of domestic married life, and the third stage is Vanaprastha, a life of growing detachment, and the fourth one is Sannyasa, living away from the family in self-denial and other worldly pursuits. Women did not have the right to inherit property, though in many respects their life was free. A widow could remarry, normally her husband's brother. In some respect, the status of a woman was later reduced to that of a Shudra. A male child was valued more than a female child. And now we'll discuss about the very religion and philosophy. So, in our next upcoming lecture, we'll discuss about the religion and philosophy that was followed during the ancient Indian civilization during the Vedic period, and also during the 6th century BC, and also in the Mahajanapadas, and the religious belief continuing during the period of Mauryan Empire up to the Guptas. And that we'll discuss in our next upcoming lecture.